Tonight we're pulling back the curtain on something hidden deep within Rome's ancient walls, a revelation so disturbing that the Vatican has concealed it for thousands of years. They didn't just bury it and walk away, they managed it, documented it, and shared its existence with only a privileged inner circle. The Annunaki, celestial entities, deities of ancient Mesopotamia whose wisdom influenced the world's first civilizations, aren't mere folklore. Somewhere within the deepest archives, their narrative survives, passed through translations, concealed in ancient texts, and woven into symbols that decorate the Church's very foundation. Those who catch a glimpse of this evidence encounter muted warnings, careers that suddenly end, and documentation that vanishes without a trace. And those who dare to speak out, their testimonies are consumed by generations of concealment. So before we venture into these vaults, before we follow the thread from ancient Sumer to the heart of Vatican City, pause for a second to hit that like button and subscribe, because the inquiries we're about to make might never have been raised before. And what we discover could transform everything you believed about our past. Under the polished marble pavements of Rome, beneath the resonance of countless prayers echoing through time, there are murmurs of something predating the Church by millennia. Something the Vatican has protected not from religious duty but from genuine fear. Picture a chamber so profound that its atmosphere has never known daylight, and inside it, secured beyond iron barriers, rest pieces of clay marked with characters from a civilization that flourished long before anyone carved the first Christian symbol. These aren't the scriptures of holy figures or disciples. They're the tongue of deities, the Annunaki, the ancient entities who, based on Sumerian records, descended from above and formed humanity. When ordinary people consider the Vatican, they envision faith, papal authority, gilded domes, and reverent melodies. Hardly anyone imagines that fundamentally concealed beneath all that sanctity might be the recollection of something not heavenly but otherworldly. Yet what if the Vatican's most guarded truth isn't what it proclaims, but what it hasn't forgotten? History shows us that the Church assumed the role of knowledge keeper following Rome's collapse. It safeguarded what others destroyed. It determined what humanity could access, could study, could accept as truth. But what occurs when the knowledge under guard doesn't discuss paradise, but instead describes entities who arrived from distant worlds? The chronicle of the Annunaki stretches back millennia before Christianity in ancient Sumer, civilization's birthplace. Their populations described deities who came down from above, who granted humanity written language, legal systems, and construction techniques. They named them the Annunaki, the ones who arrived from the heights. They were believed to have mingled with humans, educated them, governed them, and subsequently disappeared. For generations, this was rejected as legend, but legends frequently conceal truths too threatening for authority to acknowledge. Scholars have extensively investigated remnants among the ruins of Ur, Nippur, and Babylon. Cuneiform tablets detail crafts that soared through air, armaments capable of levelling mountains, and monarchs who reigned for millennia. These tablets were discovered, recorded, and then silently vanished from view. Some found homes in museum collections, others were allegedly bought by private buyers. And a handful, intriguingly, were obtained by Catholic missionaries and disappeared from sight. The Church labels it conservation. Academics call it happenstance. But what if it's something else entirely? The Vatican's collection extends across 50 miles of storage space. Within its innumerable manuscripts exist correspondence, cartography, and documentation gathered from every civilization that ever rose to power. Hidden inside are records never shared publicly, restricted by papal decree for motives understood by only a select group. What if buried among them rest the absent fragments of humanity's original narrative? A narrative where Sumer's gods and heaven's angels share the same identity. Is it possible that the Vatican understands humanity once encountered something far beyond earthly bounds? that the architects revered by ancient Sumerians aren't fantasies, but actual memories, memories etched in clay, now protected under Rome's foundation. Tonight, as St. Peter's bells ring out across the ancient city, consider this. The most profound secret might not be concealed in the heavens, but in the chamber underneath. And maybe behind those barriers, the Vatican continues to guard humanity's oldest mystery about our creators. Centuries before tales of Adam and Eve or Moses receiving the commandments, other deities walked alongside humanity. Their identities echoed across Mesopotamian wastelands, inscribed in stone ages before the first biblical passage was composed. They were known as the Annunaki, the sky travellers, the beings who originated from beyond. To Sumerian civilization, these entities weren't invisible forces or remote powers. They were tangible, commanding and remarkably human-like in appearance. They arrived from the cosmos not as illumination or vapour, but in vessels that thundered like storms. They established structure where disorder prevailed. They instructed humanity in urban planning, celestial observation, and communication through symbols pressed into moist clay. They were the original legislators, the original thinkers, and potentially the original leaders this planet ever experienced. In ancient Sumerian artwork, they're never depicted as apparitions. They're towering, powerfully built beings with wings resembling advanced flight technology rather than spiritual plumage. Surrounding them are implements that appear less like sacred emblems and more like precision instruments. Staffs and circular devices, unusual forms that contemporary minds struggle to interpret. Above their forms are celestial bodies, solar symbols, and what some researchers initially identified as star patterns. Yet their arrangement implies something different, something constructed, as though the Sumerians were documenting not devotion, but actual observation. In sanctuary writings, the Anunnaki are portrayed as arriving from the sky on pillars of fire. They selected leaders, introduced farming methods, and established legal frameworks. To that era's population, these contributions were supernatural acts. To modernize, they remarkably resemble advanced technology. Could the Anunnaki have been travellers from elsewhere, directing humanity's initial development? The oldest Sumerian documentation mentions a deity called Enki, the knowledge bearer, and his equivalent, Enlil, the commander. They were believed to have fashioned humanity from Earth's soil combined with divine essence, a narrative that would resurface generations later in Genesis. When the deities tired of human disturbances, a deluge was unleashed to purify the world. One individual received warning, constructed a craft, and endured. His identity was not Noah, but Ziashudra. The account is virtually identical, simply more ancient. These aren't random parallels. They're reverberations of a buried reality retold through different names. Contemporary scholars dismiss these accounts as mythology, arguing that primitive societies created deities to rationalize what they couldn't comprehend. But how does a culture predating the wheel describe planetary trajectories and stellar movements with such precise mathematics? How did they recognize that Earth was a sphere suspended in space when their experience stopped at the visible edge? The Sumerians insisted they received instruction from those who descended from above, the Anunnaki. Perhaps the genuine inquiry isn't whether they were real, but why their legacy required burial beneath replacement deities. If the Vatican truly comprehends who the Anunnaki represented, it's because these ancient sky entities weren't mythological gods. They were educators, and the Church for ages has kept the traces of their teachings concealed in open view. When Christianity initially emerged from the Roman Empire's margins, the landscape was already populated with deities. Every settlement, every region, every waterway claimed its own divine authority. From Egypt's brilliant temples to Greece's stone altars, humanity had extensively worshipped beings who moved, ruled, and occasionally judged from the realms above. The emerging belief system didn't arise in a vacant world. It emerged in a realm saturated with gods who appeared remarkably comparable to those the Church would subsequently designate as angels. In Christianity's formative decades following Christ, religious authorities confronted an obstacle that was both spiritual and strategic. How do you convince populations to forsake their ancestral gods when their traditions are rooted in them? The solution wasn't elimination, but transformation. Temples evolved into churches. Female deities became sanctified figures. Holy forests were redesignated blessed locations. The Church incorporated what it couldn't eliminate. The ancient world's mother goddess, Isis from Egypt or Inanna from Sumer, gradually morphed into the Virgin Mary's likeness, clothed in blue, cradling a sacred infant beneath a stellar crown. The ancient deities weren't erased. They were reincarnated, reimagined and rechristened under Christianity's symbol. But certain gods proved difficult for the Church to assimilate. The Annunaki, the primordial sky entities who preceded all others. Their narratives spoke of authority not bestowed from paradise, but arriving from the heavens. Their emblems weren't crucifixes or serpents, but celestial markers and wings, devices and flames. To classify them as angels would require acknowledging that paradise might be considerably more physical than metaphysical. To eradicate them completely would risk destroying the most ancient recorded human knowledge, so the Church chose another approach. It examined them in secrecy. As Christianity expanded, clergy and academics encountered legends from earlier cultures that paralleled biblical creation narratives too precisely to dismiss. Ziushudra's deluge, the clay-formed humans created by Enki, the celestial law stones that came before Moses. These similarities troubled theologians because they suggested a history where the Church wasn't the original speaker of God, but simply the most recent to rebrand him. In monastery chambers, religious scribes translated Sumerian and Babylonian documentation, discreetly observing their similarity to Genesis. Yet their discoveries never reached public sermons. They were stored, restricted, and marked as contradictory to doctrine. The Church that claimed the world also claimed its forgotten deities. Through time, the Annunaki were eliminated from history, their identities diminished to rumours of corrupted angels or heathen spirits. But underneath St. Peter's marble foundation, their memory might still remain, not as legend, but as proof that humanity once encountered its creators face to face. And perhaps the Vatican recognises that to maintain authority over belief, it had to suppress the gods that came first, even if those gods were the authentic designers of our origin. During the 19th century, Mesopotamia's deserts became the arena for one of history's most significant archaeological competitions. Underneath the sands of present-day Iraq and Syria rested the shattered remnants of civilization's genesis. And within those remains sat clay tablets more ancient than scripture, older than Egypt's pyramids even. They were the writings of Sumerians, Akkadians, and Babylonians, inscribed in cuneiform symbols by hands that existed millennia before Christianity. European explorers, academics, and fortune-seekers raced to possess them, each pursuing evidence of civilization's beginnings, but operating discreetly. Alongside them were others whose purpose wasn't exploration, but acquisition. Individuals dressed in modest garments and crosses, missionaries, clergy, representatives connected to the Church. To public perception, they were faithful servants, delivering God's message. Yet their correspondence reveals something different. Many were dispatched not merely to evangelize, but to retrieve, to locate relics that might contradict or validate the sacred account. Documents from the mid-19th century detail tablet shipments forwarded to Rome under church monitoring. These weren't the celebrated tablets that reached the British Museum or the Louvre. These were the ones that disappeared from records. Scholars who previously inventoried complete crates of Sumerian artifacts subsequently found them absent from documentation. Their path frequently terminated with religious organizations or private acquisitions linked to the Vatican. According to official statements, these artifacts were supposedly conserved for interpretation or shielded from profanation. But why would the Church, which operated no Mesopotamian artifact museum, be so determined to preserve them? The explanation might rest in those tablets' contents. Many described gods arriving from above, of humanity fashioned in their likeness, of leaders chosen by divine visitors. To a church teaching that creation started with Adam and Eve, such narratives were threatening. If the Anunnaki existed, if they were knowledge and power beings who came from beyond, then Genesis was no longer the origin, but a reinterpretation. In the 20th century's early years, as linguists started decoding cuneiform with improved accuracy, a subtle transformation happened. Particular translations, especially those mentioning celestial beings and aerial vehicles, were dismissed as interpretation errors and withdrawn from public access. Meanwhile, Catholic academics published heavily modified summaries emphasizing moral lessons and mythology rather than factual events. It wasn't destruction that eliminated these documents, but silence. A silence maintained through possession. By the modern era's arrival, the Vatican's archives already housed thousands of ancient manuscripts from worldwide sources. Some researchers now suspect that among those aged shelves rest portions of the missing Sumerian texts, the ones describing the Anunnaki, hidden from scholarly examination. If accurate, it indicates that while museums exhibit fragments of the ancient world, the most significant pieces remain elsewhere, beneath the Vatican's floors, where illumination and truth are strained through generations of deliberate curation. What they possess isn't merely clay. It is memory itself, formed before recorded history started. Every understanding we have about the ancient world flows through translators' interpretations. When the initial cuneiform tablets were unearthed in the mid-1800s, their symbols were incomprehensible markings until select scholars deciphered them. These initial translators became the past's gatekeepers, the limited circle through which all Sumerian, Akkadian and Babylonian knowledge would pass. With every translation came decisions. A single Sumerian term could signify sky or heaven or cosmos, depending on interpretation. Another could indicate God or Lord or simply one who arrives, and through those decisions, history could be restructured. A passage once portraying beings who originated from the stars could, with careful modification, become a metaphor for spiritual revelation. A documentation of an interaction could be transformed into a prayer. Through time, the Anunnaki's story shifted, not because the tablets were fabricated, but because their significance was modified, diluted and refined until it aligned with theological boundaries. The Church was never unaware of this. From the early 1800s, numerous linguists working in Assyriology originated from religious institutions or establishments quietly supported by the Vatican. To the world, they were language experts. To the Church, they were screens ensuring that ancient narratives wouldn't spark dangerous inquiries. The translation of sacred or pre-biblical writings was handled as a sensitive issue, one demanding spiritual oversight. Terms that might indicate the Anunnaki were actual beings, possibly visitors from another realm, were substituted with metaphorical language. Portrayals of sky vessels became glory clouds, light beams became visions, and thereby the truth was converted into myth. This wasn't forceful censorship, but through refinement, a subtle rewriting leaving no evidence. Even in contemporary times, very few individuals can fluently read ancient Sumerian. Most public knowledge about these texts derives from English or Latin translations originating from a handful of translators' work. Their interpretations, frequently influenced by theological prejudice, are accepted as truth. The original terms remain confined in museums and archives, reachable only to a select few. The Vatican's involvement in this is understated but significant. As the custodian of one of Earth's most extensive ancient manuscript collections, the Church has long grasped language's danger. If a phrase from an ancient tablet could challenge the divine creation narrative, it requires careful interpretation. If an inscription could connect Sumer's gods to the Bible's angels, it requires explanation as symbolic allegory, not evidence. Translation isn't solely about terminology, it is about authority. Through translation, history becomes what the translator permits it to be. And therefore the Anunnaki, once remembered as beings who inhabited the earth and commanded the skies, became distant legends, depleted of their reality, refined into verse. The truth was never obliterated, it was simply rewritten in a language nobody was permitted to truly comprehend. Long before Genesis was composed, Sumerian populations told narratives about gods who fashioned humanity from clay, instilled life into him, and positioned him in a garden between two mighty rivers. They called it the Divine Garden, a location where humans existed in harmony until they defied their creators and were expelled into the untamed world. Millennia passed before that ancient tale resurfaced, transformed into Hebrew scripture as the Garden of Eden. How could two societies, divided by vast stretches of time, recount identical narratives with matching particulars? Either chance defies all logic, or Eden's account wasn't original whatsoever. Within Sumerian clay records, the architects of humanity were the Anunnaki, mighty entities who came from above to bring order to our world. They fashioned mankind for labour, the soil for extraction, to fulfil their sovereign's demands. Enki reportedly combined earth with divine essence to forge the first people. Genesis tells us God shaped man from ground and infused him with life. The blueprint is identical, just the labels differ. As humanity became discontent, both Sumerian chronicles and sacred texts record a deluge commanded from the heavens. One account claims the deities chose to eradicate mankind for its clamour and defiance. The alternative version tells how the Maker annihilated his own handiwork for its transgressions. Each narrative describes one selected individual receiving advance warning. The Sumerian record names him Ziusudra. The Akkadian text calls him Utnapishtim. Hebrew scripture knows him as Noah. Everyone constructs an enormous boat, loads it with creatures, endures the catastrophe and receives celestial blessing. The most ancient flood narrative ever uncovered predates Genesis by over 2,000 years. The vessel's dimensions even show remarkable similarity. Were these prehistoric cultures exchanging metaphorical tales, or documenting an occurrence experienced by all civilization and passed down through ages? The Anunnaki allegedly selected specific family lines. They blended their essence with human stock, generating monarchs recognized as divinely descended rulers. Scripture mentions the Nephilim, celestial sons who descended to our planet and married mortal women. Both customs describe an intersection between the ethereal and earthly, between immortal entities and human bodies. The similarities extend much further. Ancient tablets mention celestial codes delivered by the deities, of structures erected to touch the sky, of consequences for mortal arrogance, of an idyllic realm forfeited. These aren't scraps from one society borrowed by another. They're segments of an unbroken strand that stretches across history, linking Sumer to holy writings. What's the significance? It indicates the accounts we regard as spiritual disclosure might actually be recollections of interaction reinterpreted to suit a new religious era. The Vatican understands this. They've examined the connections and recognized that Genesis might not be a unique creation, but a meticulously refined echo of something far more ancient. A communication from above that humanity was meant to retain, yet never permitted to completely grasp. Since the dawn of time, earthly authority has invariably claimed heavenly origins. In the most ancient Sumerian documentation, monarchs weren't selected by populations, but designated by divine powers. The records depict an epoch when sovereignty arrived from the cosmos, when the Anunnaki chose particular bloodlines to govern humanity in their place. These leaders served as connectors between the celestial and the mundane, bearing within themselves the spark of their makers. Challenging a monarch meant challenging the gods who installed him. This concept didn't vanish over time. It transformed, evolved, and persisted. Reading biblical text reveals the recurring motif. The ancestral lines of Adam, Noah, Abraham, and David receive meticulous documentation with obsessive precision, each name, each successive generation carefully maintained, seemingly to remind future sovereigns that their power originated not from their subjects, but from a consecrated lineage reaching back to time's beginning. But why? What compelled ancient writings across disparate cultures to value bloodlines so intensely, unless those lineages possessed something beyond mere symbolism? Sumerians believed their kings carried fragments of divine substance inherited from their creators, the Anunnaki. They governed not through capability, but through birthright. The identical principle resonates in the divine right of kings that dominated European history. Throughout centuries, rulers insisted they reigned by heavenly mandate, not popular consent. Yet if that right source wasn't paradise, but something more ancient, something not completely human, then global royal dynasties might be preserving an inheritance far stranger than Scripture acknowledges. The Church has perpetually guarded genealogical records, maintaining documentation of births, coronations, and royal successions. Inside Vatican repositories rest comprehensive family chronicles of monarchs extending back to eras when kings served as divine intermediaries. Hidden within those documents are peculiar references, fragments that academics seldom address. References to blood sanctified by celestial bodies, of seed transported from the cosmos. Language that seems poetic until one recalls the Sumerian accounts of the Anunnaki merging their essence with humankind. Should these ancient entities have actually created or modified humanity, and should certain lineages preserve remnants of that beginning, then authority's entire structure transforms. Contemporary religion and royalty would cease being spiritual representations, instead becoming living inheritances of contact. Maybe this explains why the Church dedicated centuries to managing genealogical documentation, blessing kings and validating successors. Acknowledging that noble blood might transcend metaphor would mean confessing that power itself descended from those who formerly governed from above. It would reveal the throne and altar as surviving elements of an ancient compact between deities and mortals. The Vatican might possess this knowledge, concealed in cryptic manuscript language and confidential collections. The privilege to rule, once considered divine, might have been extraterrestrial from the start, and reverberations of that lost agreement continue influencing our reality now. During Christianity's infancy, before Scripture consolidated into one volume, the movement was a turbulent ocean of concepts, revelations, and obscure writings. Within those compositions were portrayals of entities bearing no resemblance to the gentle angels depicted in stained glass. They were immense, radiant beings with eyes resembling blazing stars, wheels nested within wheels, voices that trembled mountains, and countenances obscured by flame. These were designated the Watchers, the Thrones, the Powers, and the Seraphim. They arrived from the firmament, imparted forbidden wisdom to humanity, and were subsequently expelled for their rebellion. For the emerging Church, these accounts posed difficulties. They sounded remarkably similar to ancient Anunnaki legends in the Book of Enoch, a document once studied alongside Scripture. However, eventually the Watchers arrive from the cosmos and interact with humans, bestowing them knowledge of metalcraft, star study, and medicine. Consequently, they face condemnation, though their contributions transformed civilization's trajectory. The pattern mirrors Sumerian descriptions of the Anunnaki descending to instruct humanity in essential skills. The resemblance proved so unmistakable that early religious scholars couldn't disregard it. They confronted a decision: either accept that these supposed angels might be identical beings previously venerated as gods, or revise the narrative so these visitors became representations of spiritual concepts, not physical reality. The choice was made without announcement. When the Church unified its teachings in the 4th century, the Watchers and other mysterious beings were deemed heretical or reinterpreted as allegories. Enoch's book was removed from official canon. Those questioning angelic nature faced silencing or labels as visionaries. From that point forward, heavenly entities received wings, garments, and aureoles. Their otherworldly majesty softened into humanoid forms suitable for sacred structures. Yet, in the concealed recesses of primitive Christian philosophy, pieces of the authentic understanding survived. Gnostics discussed archons, potent entities who constructed the physical realm. Hermetic writings depicted celestial beings administering creation from stellar realms. Even certain church authorities wrote uncomfortably about angels who descended to reside among mortals. These weren't figures of devotion, they were memories of interaction. The Vatican inherited this ambiguity and never genuinely resolved it. Within its repositories lie the non-canonical texts that speak too explicitly of beings who accompanied men, who radiated like flame, who spoke of the heavens as their origin. Across centuries, the Church converted them into representations, their chronicles diminished to metaphor. Still, the ancient words continue whispering the same reality. Scripture's angels and Sumer's gods might have been identical visitors, perceived through varied perspectives. Early religious thinkers recognized it. They decided to conceal it. And since then, humanity has venerated what it once learned to dread. Never understanding the stars overhead might contain the countenances of the very entities our forebears once named the Anunnaki. During the centuries following Christ, the account of heaven and earth underwent rewriting, not by spiritual messengers, but by officials assembled in deliberation rooms. Throughout the 2nd through 5th centuries, religious leaders and scholars convened in magnificent chambers to determine which documents would shape the Christian realm and which would be banished to obscurity. These assemblies weren't mere theological discussions, they constituted acts of selection. The cosmos as humanity previously understood it, expansive and populated with numerous beings from the stars, was compressed into a singular account that could exist securely within orthodox boundaries. The Council of Nicaea in 325, the Council of Laodicea in 363, the Council of Carthage, the Council of Chalcedon. Each phase constricted faith's perimeter. Countless writings underwent review, interrogation, and verdict. Some received divine truth designation. Others were branded heresy and eliminated. Excluded were texts describing a stratified heaven of celestial assemblies, of deities, of angels governing planetary bodies, and of humans formed through intervention instead of spontaneous divine creation. The ancient world had embraced a universe teeming with observers and architects. The councils silenced it. Enoch's book disappeared. Thomas's gospel, which suggested divinity resided within humanity itself, was suppressed. Gnostic manuscripts portraying creation as accomplished by powerful cosmic beings faced condemnation. Anything implying humans were shaped by multiple gods, by multiple intelligences, was excised. What survived was a straightforward narrative, simple to proclaim, simple to regulate. One God overhead, one creation beneath, one book to encompass everything. The Vatican would subsequently inherit these decisions' consequences within its boundaries. The rejected writings weren't completely incinerated. Numerous copies were preserved and secured. Complete destruction would erase excessive knowledge. Public disclosure would dismantle the foundation. Therefore they became restricted, confidential, classified as apocrypha, concealed cosmologies of a universe that previously included visitors, designers, and instructors from the sky. Even Scripture's vocabulary underwent transformation. The Hebrew term Elohim, a plural designation meaning gods, was retranslated as singular God. Passages formerly describing divine assemblies were reformulated into symbolism. Accounts of blazing chariots became prophetic visions. Creation acts suggesting craftsmanship were rewritten as supernatural occurrences. The revision was sophisticated, comprehensive, and intentional. By Scripture's finalization, humanity had been severed from its cosmic legacy. The emerging church wasn't constructed to investigate the stars, but to regulate heaven's narrative. The councils didn't merely establish faith, they established what humanity would be permitted to recall about its beginnings. And should those discarded texts contain memories of the Annunaki, of beings who walked among the earliest people and transmitted knowledge, then the councils achieved their goal. They didn't eliminate the proof. They simply reconstructed the universe until nobody could discern where the stars had previously contacted the Earth. Far beneath the sunlit plazas of Vatican City exists a silence more profound than masonry. It isn't the silence of devotion or contemplation. It's the silence of things never intended for disclosure. Countless passageways extend underground, bordered by ancient shelves vanishing into darkness. The Vatican Secret Archive, formerly designated as the Archivum Secretum Apostolicum Vaticanum, is a maze of recollection. No chart is comprehensive, no guest witnesses more than a portion. Even pontiffs themselves allegedly know merely part of what resides there. Picture traversing its passages, beyond doors marked in Latin, each one labelled restricted, each one protecting a realm. The atmosphere is arid, purified. The fragrance of manuscript and sediment, dense like ceremonial smoke. Beyond secured cabinets lie centuries of documentation. Yet, among the papal pronouncements and sovereign correspondence, other materials reportedly rest. Uninterpreted cuneiform impressions retrieved from 19th century excavations in Mesopotamia transmitted to Rome by missionaries who thought they'd discovered confirmation that Scripture's gods weren't solitary. Communications from Jesuit stargazers positioned in remote global locations describing peculiar luminosities traversing against stellar formations. Correspondence from clergy in Amazonian and African regions who documented tribes still worshipping sky deities and remembering visitors who descended in flames. The Church designated these materials curiosities, catalogued them under anthropology or theology, and subsequently discreetly sealed them. Nothing faces destruction. Everything receives preservation. Yet preservation doesn't equal disclosure. In one secured chamber, reportedly, rest wax-sealed tablets with inscriptions too delicate to reveal. Another compartment contains manuscripts written in unidentified scripts, some allegedly predating Hebrew itself. Academics who've glimpsed them mention diagrams of figures resembling less like angels and more like airborne men. A collection marked exclusively as Astronomia contains observations recorded by Jesuit scholars throughout the 16th through 18th centuries. Within it are illustrations of objects witnessed crossing lunar surfaces, luminosities over Rome, and annotations about alignments inconsistent with contemporary astronomy. None has been released publicly. Officially, the archive exists to safeguard papal confidentiality. Yet among its countless pages are chronicles that nobody has completely examined. Chronicles suggesting humanity's account might not belong exclusively to Earth. The archive represents a monument not to devotion but to regulation. Everything discovered, everything challenged, systematically organised. Should one access those shelves to trace the concealed trajectories of the missionaries, linguists and astronomers who populated them, a design might surface. A chronicle of interaction extending from Sumerian wastelands to New World forests, all referencing identical beings. The Vatican terms it restricted. Others might term it proof. Here, in the frigid illumination of abandoned lamps, the boundary between religion and disclosure dissolves. Somewhere within these infinite corridors, the Annunaki's account may rest, awaiting the single reader who finally receives permission to witness it. Among all orders within the Catholic Church, none have been as enigmatic or as intellectually formidable as the Jesuits. Established in the 16th century by Ignatius of Loyola, they received training as faith's intellectuals and explorers, the Church's cognitive vanguard. They voyaged across waters, charted territories, investigated the firmament, and became protectors of the Church's scientific standing. To many, they were clergy. To those comprehending their genuine function, they were the Vatican's observers, monitoring not merely the world, but the cosmos. From their inception, the Jesuits maintained a peculiar connection with the sky. They constructed Europe's earliest observatories. They documented eclipses, comets and planets with accuracy rivaling royal astronomers. When Pope Gregory XIII reformed the calendar in 1582, Jesuit mathematicians performed the calculations. They understood how to manipulate time itself into celestial harmony. Yet why would a religious organization obsess over astronomy? The official explanation claims they sought to enhance the Church's comprehension of creation. Though scattered throughout their correspondence and confidential annotations are suggestions of something profound. The Jesuits didn't merely chart stars, they investigated patterns, alignments and sequences repeating across centuries. They compared ancient Babylonian and Sumerian star maps with their contemporary observations and discovered irregularities. Constellations rendered slightly displaced, as though the sky itself had transformed since those charts were created. For them, the discrepancy wasn't arbitrary. It constituted proof that someone had previously drawn those maps from an alternative vantage point, potentially from beyond Earth. Certain Jesuit astronomers even observed that particular Sumerian myths portrayed gods who journeyed between stars. They called them the Annunaki. Discreetly they pondered whether these accounts were allegorical or factual. Their documentation, composed in Latin, was transmitted not to public institutions but exclusively to the Vatican. Nothing received publication. The order's findings travelled upward, not outward. Eventually, the Jesuits became custodians of celestial mysteries. They managed observatories in Rome, Argentina, and even on Mount Graham in Arizona, where the Vatican still operates one of the planet's most sophisticated telescopes. Officially, it examines galaxies. Unofficially, it perpetuates a tradition that commenced centuries earlier, when Jesuit priests initially directed their attention skyward, seeking not merely God, but remnants of those who might have preceded him. The Vatican never resisted science, it supervised it. By regulating astronomical knowledge flow, the Church could determine what humanity was prepared to comprehend about its cosmic position. Perhaps the Jesuits discovered more than they were authorized to disclose. Patterns suggesting prior visitations, comet records arriving too consistently, alignments indicating constellations sacred to the Anunnaki. The Jesuits mapped the heavens, yet the heavens mapped something reciprocal. And those charts, still concealed within Vatican repositories, might contain confirmation that the watchers from the stars never genuinely departed. They merely changed whose tale they told. Traverse the magnificent cathedrals of Europe and observe carefully beyond the candles and coloured glass, beyond the saints frozen in worship. Another narrative conceals itself visibly. The surfaces are alive with beings of inconceivable form. Angels forged in bronze, sculpted in marble, depicted on ceilings that appear to open into the sky. They're called God's messengers, though their configurations and implements hint at something far more ancient and peculiar. Some wear helmets resembling visors more than halos. Others grasp circular implements, gears or staffs that resemble apparatus rather than emblems. Many are encircled by flame rings or manifest inside wheels within wheels, forms too mechanical for a civilization that hadn't yet discovered machinery. To most, These are artistic embellishments, metaphors of sacred illumination. Yet what if they aren't faith's inventions? What if they're memories rendered in stone, reverberations of beings formerly witnessed by human eyes, beings the ancients designated the Annunaki? Early church artists didn't labour in seclusion. Many received instruction in workshops that inherited the visual customs of Babylon, Egypt, and Greece. They replicated from ancient prototypes without consistently comprehending their significance. When they carved winged figures descending from heavens, they weren't generating novel imagery, but maintaining ancient ones under new designation. The wings might have represented flight symbols, the halos represented radiant power symbols, the staffs represented technology beyond understanding. As the church expanded in authority, these designs were mellowed into acceptable theology. History's gods became angels, their implements transformed into faith emblems. Still, the particulars never vanished. In the Vatican's personal collection in chambers seldom displayed to the public, there are carvings and statues portraying beings with large eyes, stratified armour, and objects resembling control surfaces or helmets. Historians designate them allegories. Yet, for those familiar with Annunaki accounts, they resemble portraits of a forgotten encounter. Even the cherubim protecting the Ark of the Covenant in biblical portrayals resemble ancient Sumerian protectors, partially human, partially avian, partially mechanical. The identical configuration recurs in medieval paintings, in Ezekiel's luminous revelations, in Renaissance dome spiraling designs. Every generation retold what it witnessed through language it comprehended. To the ancients, these visitors were gods. To the prophets, they were angels. To the artists, they were revelations. Yet the configuration never altered. Perhaps these artworks aren't confirmation, but recollection, humanity's collective endeavour to maintain what couldn't be articulated. The Church never rejected these depictions. It simply redefined them. It permitted the sculptures and paintings to persist, yet buried their beginnings beneath doctrinal strata. When we traverse the Vatican museums, we're encompassed by these silent observers, cast in gold and marble, smiling gently, as though entertained by what they've become. Angels, certainly, yet perhaps also the final remnant of the ones who arrived from the stars, remembered not by their designations, but by the radiance that formerly shone from their eyes. Every ancient revelation commences identically, a spade contacting stone, a wisp of history ascending from the sediment. Archaeologists and missionaries alike formerly wandered Mesopotamian deserts, excavating where empires had disintegrated, revealing clay tablets inscribed with marks that hadn't been interpreted for millennia. They transmitted their discoveries to museums, universities, and occasionally directly to the Vatican. Initially, every revelation was welcomed. Yet, as translations began materializing, a peculiar design surfaced. The tablets discussing commerce or cultivation were exhibited. Those portraying sky beings, light machines, or humanity's crafting quietly vanished. Some were designated as compromised or mislocated. Others were claimed as components of restricted donations. Several were never referenced again. During the late 1800s, a surge of revelations across Iraq and Syria inundated European museums with relics. Though within several decades the most contentious pieces were absent from public documentation. Missionaries who had accompanied the expeditions wrote correspondence to Rome portraying carvings of winged figures positioned before peculiar apparatus or inscriptions discussing the Anunnaki descending to fashion humanity from clay combined with divine blood. The Church designated these communications intriguing yet unconfirmed. Shortly afterward, the relics were relocated for conservation. They were never witnessed again. Even in contemporary times, the identical design recurs. When a museum reveals a tablet that contests the established chronology or proposes sophisticated knowledge, the object is reclassified, loaned, or quietly returned to an undisclosed institution. Curators whisper regarding missing containers, mislabeled shipments, or foreign collectors with exclusive authorization. Every piece connecting human origin to the stars appears to disappear identically into silence. The Vatican's involvement in this is rarely chronicled, though its presence is perpetual. Numerous early excavation teams were funded or counselled by church-affiliated scholars. Jesuit linguists frequently managed initial translations. Artifacts considered theologically sensitive were recommended for restricted storage under conservation pretense. Once inside those collections, they joined an expanding accumulation of pieces too hazardous to exhibit. The official rationale is consistently safety, humidity, or insufficient confirmation. Yet history demonstrates that when knowledge threatens devotion, disappearance becomes the safest reaction. Certain scholars who attempted to discuss these absent relics found their professions suddenly terminated. Others published brief references in obscure publications that were subsequently retracted. The design is too calculated to disregard. Humanity's account is being modified not by flames, but by omission. Every artifact that vanishes creates a void where a disclosure might have existed. Should these absent pieces ever be unveiled, they might demonstrate that our ancestors didn't merely conceive gods, they documented encounters. The Church doesn't incinerate what it dreads anymore, it stores it, and thus the Annunnaki's account remains fragmented, buried again, not beneath sand, but beneath strata of administration and confidentiality. The pathway terminates not in a wasteland, but in secured chambers, where reality is maintained so flawlessly that nobody may ever witness it again. Currently, the concept that ancient gods were visitors from the cosmos has become amusement. It populates documentaries, talk programs, and digital discussions crowded with extreme theories and inflated assertions. The expression ancient aliens has evolved into a catchphrase, not an inquiry. It provokes laughter instead of examination. Though beneath the clamour rests something more substantial, something the Vatican and other influential institutions quietly comprehend. When reality is enveloped in absurdity, nobody ventures to consider it seriously. The concept becomes a jest, and the proof, even if genuine, is rejected without examination. This is how regulation functions in the contemporary realm, not through suppression but through mockery. The ancient Sumerian tablets, the peculiar portrayals of sky beings, the accounts of gods descending in flame, all of it currently exists in the identical category as conspiracy theories. The population disregards it. Academics safeguard their standing, and the Church remains quiet. In that quietness, it prevails. Because for centuries, the Vatican has recognized that these myths reflect the earliest iterations of biblical accounts. They portray creation, floods, and divine messengers not as supernatural occurrences, but as incidents. Should the Church acknowledge even the prospect that the Anunnaki were genuine visitors, it would reshape divine exclusivity's foundation. Therefore, it permits the discussion to persist in disorder, guaranteeing that anyone approaching the subject is classified eccentric. The more inflated the public discourse becomes, the safer the reality remains. Contemporary media fulfills its function flawlessly. Ancient astronaut theories are displayed alongside fantasy and pseudoscience. They're characterized as intrigue, not investigation. This obscures the distinction between substantial historical questions and absolute fiction. The Vatican doesn't need to suppress the proof when society has already learned to ridicule it. The irony is that the individuals proclaiming loudest regarding aliens in ancient history might be unknowingly safeguarding the very authorities they accuse. By converting the mystery into performance, they render it untouchable by legitimate scholars. Concealed within the clamour could be truth fragments, ancient inscriptions, genetic proof, architectural designs that connect humanity's beginning to a far older account. Yet the instant anyone attempts to investigate it seriously, the ridicule commences and the entrance closes. For the Church, that entrance must remain closed. It maintains its divine authority by permitting the absurd to protect the genuine. It recognizes that conviction can endure uncertainty, but not confirmation. Should the Anunnaki be confirmed to have fashioned humanity, then Genesis would become a historical documentation, not a divine disclosure. The Vatican cannot risk that metamorphosis. Therefore, the myth is permitted to exist as myth, distorted, inflated, and perpetually derided. In this manner, the reality remains concealed in plain sight, safeguarded not by confidentiality, but by clamour. The most ancient authority technique is not to reject the reality, but to bury it beneath confusion until nobody can distinguish between a question worth posing and an account manufactured to be forgotten. Should the Anunnaki genuinely have fashioned humanity? Should they have walked among the earliest people and left genuine remnants of their knowledge, capability, and potentially even their DNA, then Christian doctrine's entire foundation becomes unstable. Original sin. The concept that humanity inherited a moral defect from a singular act in Eden suddenly generates questions. Should humans have been engineered by celestial beings? Was disobedience genuinely a moral failure or merely a reaction to intervention? Salvation too becomes more complex. Should we be the creation of a lineage contacted by sophisticated creators, then redemption's promise through Christ might not be the exclusive pathway to comprehending our beginning or objective. The incarnation itself, the instant God became man, acquires new dimensions. Was it an intervention upon additional interventions? Was it one stratum in a prolonged sequence of contact, advancement, and direction? The theological ramifications are explosive. Every doctrine constructed on humanity's assumption as a singular omnipotent deity's creation would require re-examination. The Church couldn't casually acknowledge earlier God's presence, because doing so would compel believers to confront a realm where divine authority is distributed, disputed, and potentially even empirical. The very concept that someone else, someone more ancient and more powerful than humans, participated in forming us, creating our intelligence and culture's framework, contests centuries of instruction. It proposes that Scripture, the revelation texts, might be merely one segment in an account that commenced long before the earliest prophets walked the earth. To maintain its spiritual authority, the Church must preserve God's role exclusivity in creation. Acknowledging prior intervention would mean acknowledging that humanity possesses a history outside Scripture, a history where angels or the Annunaki instructed, fashioned, and potentially directed civilization's trajectory. This explains why the Vatican has dedicated centuries to regulating manuscripts, translations, and textual access. The objective is not merely to maintain knowledge, but to maintain interpretation. Should anyone confirm that humans are descended from beings with their individual plans, designs, and intelligence, then devotion becomes complicated. It becomes a question of legacy, not compliance. Even the most fundamental moral teachings would be recontextualized, because sin's origin, death's significance, and redemption's pathway all depend on human creation's narrative. An engineered humanity is a humanity with inherited knowledge, not inherited culpability. And a humanity with knowledge might not require salvation in the conventional sense. This is the theological constraint that the Church quietly diffuses through silence, confidentiality, and selective preservation. The Anunnaki, should they be genuine, represent an authority lineage predating God's account as conveyed in Christian doctrine. And any institution constructed on divine exclusivity cannot permit that lineage's acknowledgement. Doing so would not merely rewrite theology, it would rewrite our comprehension of ourselves, our beginnings, and our cosmic position. The Anunnaki's fingerprints, whether in myths, DNA, or forgotten knowledge, threaten the Church's central assertion that God alone fashioned mankind. This explains why their memory has been meticulously managed, buried beneath centuries of doctrine, and filtered through translation layers, canonization, and interpretation until even prior God's possibility feels impossible to contemplate. The most powerful instrument in any institution isn't always compulsion or retribution. Sometimes it is quietness. The Vatican doesn't need to publicly reject the Anunnaki's existence or the prospect that humanity was contacted by beings from the stars. It only needs to never completely validate it. By remaining silent, the Church permits believers to maintain devotion, confident in a history they were instructed to trust. Science continues along its individual trajectories, investigating genetics, archaeology, and astronomy without questioning the foundations excessively. Peripheral researchers pursue anomalies, publish contentious papers, and attract attention precisely because the mainstream disregards them. In that manner, silence contains the discussion. The Anunnaki become a speculation subject, not reality, and the boundary between proof and fantasy obscures. Missionaries, scholars, and Jesuits across centuries have constructed a network not merely of knowledge, but of regulated access to knowledge. Ancient tablets, translations, charts, and correspondence all traverse supervision layers. Certain information is released selectively enough to satisfy intrigue, while the most sensitive pieces, texts suggesting sophisticated technology, celestial visitors, or humanity's engineering, remain concealed, catalogued as restricted or heretical. The outcome is a flawless equilibrium. Humanity learns sufficiently to remain compliant to devotion. Investigators perceive anomalies but cannot confirm their significance. Scholars who endeavour to contest the narrative are marginalised or dismissed. The Church need not dispute or assault, it merely observes. Silence generates its individual authority. Every unexplained relic, every peculiar inscription, every tablet withdrawn from circulation reinforces the perception that certain things are excessively hazardous to manage. In past centuries, silence safeguarded power through manuscripts. Currently, it safeguards power through archive regulation, restricted access, and institutional legitimacy's weight. Anyone challenging the official account is evaluated against a barrier of centuries of scholarship, doctrine, and legal regulation. The Anunnaki are thus contained without confrontation. They exist in recollection, but cannot emerge completely into history. By permitting the subject to drift in public imagination, enveloped in myth, inflation, and sensationalism, the Church guarantees that any potential disruption is submerged in clamour. The population dismisses it as legend, television programmes inflate it for viewership, and legitimate science avoids it for ridicule apprehension. Those few who investigate deeper encounter countless minor obstacles, from restricted collections to uncooperative curators, from substantially edited translations to conflicting documentation. Silence, in this instance, transcends strategy. It is architecture. It channels intrigue into harmless passages and isolates the few who might approach the reality. And when the occasional fragment escapes into visibility, it is swiftly recontextualized, reclassified, or discredited. The outcome is a flawless containment mechanism spanning centuries in which the Church maintains regulation not by weaponry, but by shaping what can be articulated, investigated, and believed. Conviction itself becomes a confinement. Through silence, the Vatican guarantees that even sophisticated beings' concept, the Anunnaki, the Watchers of Sumerian legend, never completely escapes the repositories, never completely contests doctrine, and never interrupts humanity's account that the Church has dedicated millennia carefully curating. Beyond the quiet entrances of libraries, seminaries, and concealed collections, there are whispers few ever perceive. Theologians mention manuscripts too sensitive for general eyes, texts so ancient and peculiar that their contents might disrupt centuries of instruction. Archivists who have dedicated decades organizing and maintaining collections occasionally suggest documents that were never intended for publication, works that address humanity's origins, the sky's watchers, or the knowledge delivered by beings the ancients once designated gods. Translators, too, occasionally encounter phrases that don't conform to the accepted narrative. A passage that hints at beings from above, an instrument for charting the cosmos, or People crafted with intention transforms into an inquiry demanding caution. To press forward, to draw the explicit link between holy writings and otherworldly intelligence means inviting danger. Professional lives have crumbled this way. Researchers who ventured too far found themselves reassigned, their publications stopped or funding silently removed. Some stepped away suddenly with minimal reasoning. Others disappeared from scholarly circles completely. The pattern holds steady. When a concept questions the sole account of divine making, it crashes against ages of established power. Those working at the margins, those examining where scripture, legend and excavation meet, must walk a careful line. Even the slightest implication that humanity might have been moulded by travellers from beyond risks being marked as blasphemous or odd. It isn't open suppression, it's understated, a quiet warning, a footnote in a publication, a courteous decline to support an interpretation. The research persists quietly, behind the scenes, behind secured doors, away from general awareness. Some insiders mention documents with margins crowded with annotations in Latin and Greek, expressions like content too delicate or restricted from public examination. They reference pages describing sophisticated understanding provided to humans, directives from beings the ancients honoured, and records that come before biblical timelines. Still, the repositories keep their secrecy. Those given this understanding are held by vows and custom. To disclose too much means breaking a link preserved across ages. Even when pieces of these documents surface in scholarly conversations, they're substantially censored. The reality is implied but never validated. It hovers at the periphery, alluring, hazardous, and partial. Those who encounter it rapidly understand the limits of the structure. A promising professional trajectory can abruptly narrow. Conference invitations vanish. Papers get turned down. University appointments evaporate. It's a message echoed through the centuries. Understanding that contests the account isn't eliminated, but it's restricted. The murmurs continue, though, among archivists and academics, researcher, linguist, and religious thinker. Tales of strange discoveries, peculiar engravings, and descriptions of the Annunaki move discreetly. They're shared through dialogue, suggested in citations, and meticulously recorded in personal notebooks. For those paying close attention, it grows obvious that the quiet itself proves something. The Church doesn't need to deny the presence of celestial beings. It merely needs to guarantee that those who could validate it remain on the edges, murmurs dissolving into the still hallways of the past. If the reality about humanity's beginning ever surfaces, it won't arrive through disorder. It will come through management. The Vatican and the planet's other major institutions recognize that data can hold more strength than any military force. They understand that abrupt revelation destroys conviction, but incremental revelation remolds it. If acknowledgement happens, it won't be delivered as a jolt, but presented as a mild adjustment. Heavenly messengers will transform into extraterrestrial ambassadors. Sacred involvement will transform into supervised development. And the Annunaki will be recast as misread representations of humanity's emergence. The narrative won't alter entirely. It will just be revised to match the reality that's already present, refined until it seems recognizable, reassuring, and secure. That's how reality gets controlled. The Church has managed this previously. When star science demonstrated that Earth circled the Sun, the Vatican ultimately embraced it, not as surrender, but as a richer comprehension of existence. When Earth science uncovered the planet's age, belief adjusted by framing it as segment of God's enigmatic schedule. When Darwin's concept of natural selection surfaced, religious thinkers repositioned it as a sacred process. Each significant finding has been integrated instead of resisted. The identical approach would extend to the Annunaki. The Church wouldn't reject their reality. If the proof turned undeniable, it would re-examine it. The Anunnaki would transform into tools of sacred purpose, ancient representatives of formation. Their deeds would be incorporated into theology as components of God's design. The structure would stay unchanged, and the believers would be comforted that nothing fundamental had shifted. But, in actuality, everything would have shifted. The threat isn't that humanity discovers its makers were previously confused with deities, but that the disclosure will be framed as another expression of worship. The Vatican has dedicated centuries perfecting this practice of containment. It understands how to disclose reality without releasing authority. When acknowledgement comes, it will be orchestrated. Records will emerge gradually, paired with sanctioned explanations. Researchers will be steered toward acceptable findings. Cultural institutions will design displays that combine wonder with devotion, guaranteeing nobody challenges the spiritual hierarchy. This way, the revelation of data becomes not devastation, but taming. Humanity will be informed it has new companions across the cosmos, that belief and knowledge were never adversaries, that our beginnings are expansive and puzzling, but still beneath sacred direction. The existing hierarchies will persist because they'll assert to have anticipated it from the start. The reality won't liberate humanity. It will be handled, parcelled and translated until it benefits the same authorities that previously concealed it. And in that instant, when the planet thinks it has ultimately awakened, the most ancient mystery of all will stay untouched. The Anunnaki will remain concealed beneath language, representation and belief, converted once more into legends that defend the framework instead of question it. The revelation won't arrive as flame, it will arrive as clarification, and it will leave the planet precisely as it existed, only more compliant. Throughout the ancient realm, accounts of beings arriving from above emerge repeatedly. In Sumer, the Anunnaki moved alongside humans, instructing, directing and forming societies. In Egypt, deities with glowing headdresses and wings brought understanding to rulers, revealing to mortals the mysteries of star observation, healing and construction. In Mesoamerica, Quetzalcoatl and other plumed dragons descended from above, delivering understanding of farming, timekeeping and holy mathematics. In India, the Vedic writings depict Devas who came down to instruct humanity, commanding authority over natural forces and leading monarchs across lands. Across ages, the design is clear, a limited number of heavenly beings affecting the direction of human society. Still, despite this remarkable resemblance, the Church has never initiated a public dialogue linking these legends. The Vatican, as the primary authority on faith and ancient writing, examines the faiths of the planet carefully. Missionaries have extensively documented native traditions. Jesuit academics have interpreted Vedic verses, and record keepers maintain manuscripts from every region of the world. They recognize the design. They must. And still the conversation never surfaces. Why? To acknowledge that such resemblances indicate actual historical interaction with intelligent, non-human entities would contest core teachings of formation, sacred exclusivity, and human distinction. It would demand a reassessment of holy history, descent, and the position of the Church itself. Quiet becomes the instrument. The design persists, but it's never identified. Each legend is addressed independently, characterized as metaphor, myth, or chants. Anthropologists and chroniclers are permitted to theorize, but they seldom arrive at the most profound conclusion that humanity has been molded, instructed, and directed by powers beyond our realm. The Vatican gains from this division by documenting understanding without exposing its links. It preserves both power and enigma. The faithful keep viewing God as the sole origin of existence. Academics stay intrigued, yet limited. The tales of Quetzalcoatl, the Anunnaki, and the Vedic Devas are pieces, but never compiled into a unified image that could expose the genuine extent of human past. Even when resemblances are identified, the dialogue is redirected. Beings from above become symbols for ethics, natural phenomena, or creative narration. The profound meanings are concealed, and so the planet persists, unknowing. The design exists for those prepared to recognize it, but those holding power guarantee that public awareness never occurs. The inquiry becomes inescapable. If these legends repeat throughout time and location, and if the Vatican has examined all of them, what does it signify that nobody ever links the evidence publicly? The response isn't coincidental, it's deliberate. The Church preserves the account of soul creation, of sacred power, of belief as the primary route for humanity. Acknowledging that humanity may have been directed by celestial beings throughout the world would rewrite the account of society itself. Designs persist, the Vatican can't disregard them, and still it opts to let them stay. Murmurs secured in manuscripts concealed in repositories, and abandoned for those at the boundaries to contemplate. In that decision, authority and concealment persist, quietly moulding how humanity interprets its history, its current state, and its position among the cosmos. The Anunnaki, if genuine, signify more than simply deities of lore. They're a documentation of involvement, of understanding passed from beings outside of humanity, of design and direction that moulded the first societies. To recognize them completely means recognizing that humanity has never been wholly autonomous, that rulers, clergy, and leaders were executing plans written by entities from the cosmos. This reality weakens the very basis of spiritual power. The Church portrays itself as the intermediary between God and humanity, the exclusive translator of sacred intention and the guardian of redemption. If humans were influenced by another intelligence before God's design materialized, the assertion of soul power becomes vulnerable. The Anunnaki could reshape history not through force, but by being. Their inheritance, woven into legends, relics, and ancient understanding, indicates a sequence of authority preceding Scripture itself. To confess it publicly would mean confessing that belief is constructed upon a pre-existing structure, that sacred power is positioned over human design guidance and potentially control. The most secure path, from the viewpoint of those holding power, was to remove the Anunnaki from shared recollection, to merge their account into legend, to speak their identities in hidden texts, to maintain the tablets, the documents and the inscriptions secured in repositories and personal holdings. By labelling them myth, the Church could sustain authority over the account of formation, of rulership and of redemption. The population would keep believing in a reality authored exclusively by God, unaware of the deeper lines of influence. Missionaries, academics and Jesuits across centuries guaranteed that the understanding of the Anunnaki never became accepted history. When tablets came from Mesopotamia or documents described heavenly visitors among native populations, the most threatening sections were censored, stored, or silently vanished. Those who challenged the procedure were marginalized or undermined. Across time, the account of the Anunnaki was diminished to theory, marginal study, and popular culture, all while the reality stayed quietly maintained for those considered able to grasp it without disrupting belief. The contradiction is that the Anunnaki never genuinely vanished. They persist in representations, in legends, in imagery, in the construction of the ancients, and in the borders of concealed manuscripts. Still, by managing the conversation, the Church guaranteed that their presence would never contest power. Even currently, when writings and relics suggest sophisticated understanding, strange involvements, or direction from the cosmos, they're portrayed as oddities, accidents, or metaphor. The deliberate transformation of the Anunnaki into legend safeguarded the structure and maintained the appearance of spiritual supremacy. By maintaining their recollections secured, humanity's account could be presented as a straightforward progression from formation to redemption, uninterrupted by proof of other intelligences directing our route. The Anunnaki became both too threatening to expose and too significant to eliminate. They persist as traces, reminding us that human past is more intricate than the accounts we're permitted to encounter, and that certain realities are deliberately tucked away, maintained only for the select who understand where to search. Move through St. Peter's Square and the Vatican itself, and observe carefully beyond the magnificence, beyond the stone, beyond the visitors and formal display. There are indicators that suggest something older, something nearly lost. The papal vestments, with its triple crowns, the golden instruments and the staffs, is more than ritual. It holds reflections of ancient power, a visual vocabulary that comes before the church. Represented in gold, jewels, and representations, lions and eagles surface repeatedly, protecting entrances carved into artwork, positioned above sanctuaries. To most, their basic heraldry, representations of strength, watchfulness, and bravery. But in earlier cultures, they signified powers from above, beings who maintained control over human fate. Obelisks extend from courtyards stretching toward the sky. Their roots trace to Egypt, a society that venerated deities who arrived from the cosmos. When the Church transported these structures to Rome, it didn't erase their significance. It reimagined, it incorporated it into the design of belief, making the representations familiar while maintaining their memory preserved. Star coronets surface in murals and on ritual garments. They crown images of saints, pontiffs, and heavenly figures. Still, their construction mirrors celestial designs documented thousands of years before. Star patterns, holy alignments, and cosmic themes are present throughout if you understand how to observe. Each element is a marker, a murmur from history, a reminder of the beings whose recollection the Church inherited, but couldn't completely recognize. Visitors moving through the Vatican may notice only the spiritual account. The faithful notice God, the structure notices custom, and most academics notice artistry. Few detect that the structure itself is a collection of forgotten deities, representations distributed across ages, misread or renamed to align with teaching. The instruments, the coronets, the creatures, and the structures aren't evidence of earlier visitors. Still, they suggest a persistence. They indicate that the Church grasped something about humanity's history that it couldn't disclose. Even the arrangement of the Vatican is revealing. Placements of obelisks, domes, and sanctuaries reflect earlier cosmologies. Pathways match with seasonal shifts. Sanctuaries direct toward distant celestial bodies, and chambers maintain mysterious proportions in their building. These aren't arbitrary. They're reflections of an understanding too ancient to express openly. Those who built, positioned, and preserved these representations were conscious of their sources. By relabeling them as Christian, the Vatican guaranteed their continuation while managing interpretation. The communication is delicate. Observe carefully, and the account of the Anunnaki, the observers and celestial guides, speaks through gold, rock, and stone. The Vatican doesn't need to declare it. The hints persist for those willing to notice, distributed across ages, always existing, always apparent, yet grasped by nearly nobody. The structure, the artistry, and the ceremony become a quiet repository. It's a collection of misremembered deities, an assembly of authority, recollection, and concealment. And if you understand where to observe, the representations will disclose an account that's older than belief itself. If the Vatican genuinely possesses understanding that humanity's beginnings extend beyond the accounts in the Bible, that we share our start with beings who arrived from above, then quiet becomes an inquiry that can't be dismissed. Why would an institution tasked with directing souls and maintaining reality withhold something so essential? The ethical pressure is enormous. On one side, the Church might contend that disclosure of such understanding could trigger disorder, undermine belief, and destabilize social structure. People might challenge sacred power, reread scripture, or feel deceived by ages of instruction. Fear then becomes the justification offered for quiet, a safeguard not just of the institution, but of the believers themselves. Still, the contrary perspective is just as persuasive. Humanity possesses a claim to its complete account, to understand the scope of its past, to grasp the beings who moulded the first societies, and to recognize the designs that extend across continents and ages. When data is suppressed, understanding is managed, and inquiry. Curiosity is punished by omission. The line between protection and control blurs. The Vatican has spent centuries curating what can be read, who can translate, and which artifacts are accessible. Tablets from Mesopotamia, letters from missionaries, Jesuit reports on celestial phenomena. All have been filtered, archived, and often hidden. Those who stumble too close to conclusions connecting the Annunaki with scripture are silenced. Indirectly, through academic pressures, redacted publications, and career obstacles, the moral question deepens. Is withholding knowledge truly for the good of humanity? Or is it a way to maintain spiritual and cultural authority? By controlling the past, the Church controls the interpretation of the present and the future. Every myth reframed, every tablet sequestered, every symbol explained as allegory rather than memory reinforces a hierarchy of understanding. Faith survives, but understanding is constrained. Imagine if the truth were revealed, humans engineered, guided or uplifted by beings whose story predates written history. The implications for theology, philosophy and society are profound. Original sin, salvation, divine authority, and even the uniqueness of humanity would have to be reconsidered. The Vatican knows this, and so silence becomes the default. Protection and control coexist in the same act, the faithful remain faithful, the scholars cautious, and the public largely unaware. Yet even as centuries pass, fragments of the story leak through art, architecture, myths, and hidden archives. The evidence is scattered, subtle, and often misinterpreted. Those who seek it must learn to read the patterns in plain sight and question the stories they were taught to accept. The question remains: does humanity deserve to know? Or is it too late to lift the veil? Silence preserves stability, but it comes at the cost of curiosity, freedom, and the right to the full human story. The Vatican, holding the keys to the earliest chapters of civilization, chooses silence as both shield and sword, leaving the moral question for each generation to wrestle with, as the truth waits patiently in the shadows beneath the bustling streets of Rome. Beyond the marble floors and gilded ceilings, there lies a vault so deep, so heavily guarded, that its contents have been whispered about for centuries, yet never fully revealed. It is here, in the Archivum Secretaris Vaticanum, that the memory of civilizations, of kings, of sacred texts, and perhaps of the Annunaki themselves, rests. We may not know the full story of these beings, whether they walked among humans as gods, teachers, or engineers. What we do know is that someone does. Someone holds the keys to knowledge that stretches back through thousands of years, to a time before written history, before empires rose and fell, before humanity fully understood its place in the cosmos. The vault itself is silent, yet it speaks. Every shelf, every carefully catalogued manuscript, every clay tablet hidden from public view is a testament to decisions made in shadow. Decisions about what humanity should see, what it can handle, and what must remain just out of reach. The Anunnaki, if they existed, are only part of the story. Their presence raises questions that shake the foundations of faith, history, and identity. If humanity was shaped, guided, or influenced by beings from the stars, then everything we have been taught about creation, divine authority, and our origins must be reconsidered. That door beneath Rome locks more than just documents. It locks our certainty. It forces us to confront the possibility that history is incomplete, that religion is filtered, and that identity is shaped as much by omission as by revelation. Yet there is power in the unknown. The most dangerous secret is not that the Annunaki might have existed. The most dangerous secret is that someone decided you should never be sure. Belief can be manipulated, history rewritten, and knowledge concealed. But questions are harder to control. Every scholar who peeks at the margins, every theologian who wonders, every curious mind that reflects refuses to accept. The surface story keeps the question alive, and in that questioning lies freedom. The vault beneath Rome is vast, and its doors remain closed. We may never walk inside, and we may never see the texts, the symbols, or the artifacts that have been carefully preserved, but the shadow of what lies within stretches far beyond the stone walls into libraries, museums, and the myths that have survived. We can sense it, study it, and imagine it. To confront the unknown is not to deny faith or history. It is to embrace the fullness of curiosity, to acknowledge that knowledge is never complete and that truth may be layered, obscured, and curated. And so we return to the question that began this journey. Who were the Anunnaki, and why does a central authority hold their memory so tightly? Perhaps we will never know completely. Perhaps that door will remain closed for centuries more. But the act of asking, of keeping the possibility alive, is itself an act of reclamation. The last locked door is a reminder that the human story is unfinished, that curiosity is essential, and that the search for truth is never truly complete. We must not bow to certainty.